Yes, record. Here we go. Okay.
So I turned it on, so it should be good to go.
You did. Thank you. I was like, it's giving me a notification that someone else did it. I'm sorry.
It was my fault. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much. And so by participating, your attendance in this seminar tonight is consent for the video recording and for publishing. We will have ASL interpreters who you already see on our screen this evening. So if you can be mindful of that when you are speaking, or if you ask a question towards the end, to give some time and speak slowly enough so that we can keep up, because I like to speak fast. So I'm even modulating myself a little bit. Keep your sound on mute while we are going through the presentation. You can put your questions into chat. There's a Q&A that we're going to have at the end, but there will be some interactive things happening throughout the presentation as well. So when the presenters ask you to do those, also throw those in chat. They may call for some folks to speak as well if you're comfortable with that. Closed captioning is available and can be found in your toolbar settings if you don't already see them. And if you could please say your name before you speak so that we know who's talking with us. All right. And then, so for the land acknowledgement this evening, we in the Seattle Special Education PTSA acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of Duwamish people, a people that are still here, continuing to honor and to bring the light of their ancient heritage. We pay respect to the Coast Salish elders, past and present, and extend that respect to their descendants and all the Indigenous people. To acknowledge this land is to recognize the history of physical and cultural genocide and settler colonialism, which continues to displace Indigenous people today. It is also to recognize these lands, waters, and their significance for the resilient and wise peoples who continue to thrive in this region despite the consequences of displacement and the broken treaties. So we have a link here that, let's see, Heather, can you share that for me? That would be great. Talks about more about the Duwamish tribe and how you might want, if you want to learn some more about them as well. Today's presentation will be presented by WABDA, or the Washington branch of the International Dyslexia Association. And Cindy Dupuy and Sandra Guth are both here. They're going to do their own introductions at the beginning of their presentation, but they are here today to talk to us about the science of reading 101, and what does all of those things mean, and what does that mean for our students who might be affected or might need the input of the science of reading literature. So parents and teachers need to understand these key characteristics of structured literacy so that both current and future students can become effective and efficient lifelong readers. And so again, I just want to remind you, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat as we go along, and we'll collect them. But I'm going to hand it off to both Cindy and to Sandra. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Happy to be here. Sandra, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm Sandra Guth. Oh, thank you, by the way, for that. I'm Sandra Guth, and I am a reading intervention specialist in Olympia, Washington. I'm in private practice, and prior to this, I taught 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 2nd grade in public and private schools, and I've also taught middle school, and I was an instructor in the adult basic education program at South Puget Sound Community College.
I'm Cindy Dupuy. I have a PhD in learning disabilities out of Northwestern University. I have a master's degree in secondary education, which includes endorsements in sciences, as well as special education. I am also an adult who has dyslexia and dysgraphia, so I bring my own direct personal experience to this entire process. So let us pop into the actual slides here. We are going to provide the entire slideshow to the group after we're done. So if you don't feel like you've got all of the notes as we go through, they'll be made available afterwards. So please spend your time listening and trying to gain the information and not worrying so much about trying to write down tons. So the first question, many of you, let me back that up. So the reason that we're here today is when we look at this graph, this is the pattern of scores for the past 25 years in the area of reading. And if you'll look down here on this bottom row, those are the proficiency scores across the United States in reading. Those are the test scores across the United States in reading. This big red arrow here is the level we should have our students at to actually be proficient readers. I'm hoping the first thing that you notice is that there's not been a significant change in the performance of any of our readers in the past 25 years. And that's a great deal of what we're going to talk about tonight. If you are curious, this 280 line is the level of proficiency for 8th grade students. And the 300 line here is the level of proficiency for our 12th grade students. So what does this actually mean in reality? If you were to go across the entire United States and randomly sample 100 students, only 35% of those students would be able to read proficiently. 65% of our student body is not able to read proficiently at this time. So this leads us into the focus of the topic is, what does science tell us about this? Now, we've introduced ourselves as the Washington branch of the International Dyslexia Association. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more in just a minute. But to begin with, we've got some very clear goals. Sandra, do you want to take the overview here?
Sure, we'll begin with a discussion and dispelling some myths, basically, things that you may have come up against and even kind of worked with for a while. And then from there, we will move into the 6 elements that science tell us are really important for effective reading, and we'll unpack each of those as we go. And we want you to leave here with some really concrete strategies and activities that you can do with your student or with your child right away.
As we move through the presentation, as we transition from those 3 areas, that slide will come up again and you'll see when we're moving out of the different areas. So my specific goals for you as learners in this environment is I want you to come away understanding the fundamental skills that your students need to be able to become fluent, competent readers. We want you to be able to identify some 3, 4 of the 6 specific characteristics of good, effective reading instruction. And then you should go home with specific strategies for your students or student to work on to improve their reading. So we're going to give you a few seconds here to read these statements. And I'm going to go to a second slide, but we're just going to be quiet and let you read and process this for a minute. And then a next set of statements. So our first statement that we would like you to think about is whether or not reading is a developmental construct. And the reality is that this is an absolute myth. Language development language is developmental. So we begin learning words and we eventually put words together to make sentences. And then our complexity of our sentences extend over time and as our skills begin to grow. Learning to read is not a developmental process. It is not, if any of you studied Piaget, it is not a range of ages where we expect a particular band of you're going to build a particular skill set in a particular period of time. We do know that we have optimal ways of assessing where a student's reading is and what their underlying skill set is. Now, we can have students that are struggling to learn to read because they have inherent issues in language skills, but much of what we can do in teaching the science of reading can address those underlying issues. There is a tendency in the school systems to communicate to parents that students will eventually be able to grow out of a weakness. This is a misnomer because it's a wait to fail model. We don't have to wait to establish that a student doesn't have the reading skills that they need to move forward. We've got our next statement here, which this is also a myth. So most students are intrigued by stories and intrigued by books. When you have young children and you bring out the exciting stories, kids want to come around you. Being read to is fascinating, it's fun. So when kids are viewed as lazy, it's often because they don't have the underlying skill set that they need to come to the reading activity. And so the perception of not trying is a misreflection of what their true abilities are. Now, we do have underlying issues: attention deficit, auditory processing disorder, dyslexia. Those factors can absolutely affect a student's ability to come to the text. But as we're going to discuss, we have clear science that tells us how to treat and address that element. Kids inherently want to be able to read like their peers. You will often find students in class that mask their inability to read. They will, if asked to read aloud, they will read very softly or they'll mumble through the word so that nobody can really hear the error that they've made. I have many kids tell me that when they're called to read on in class, they will count ahead to find out what paragraph they're supposed to be on so that they've got a shot at trying to figure out what's actually there. We want to help those students move past that. So a next fallacy that we run into is that if kids have enough exposure to print, if they've been given enough opportunity, they will naturally learn to read. And unfortunately, the science in this area does not substantiate that claim at all. We need to be giving direct, clear instruction in reading to build the skill set. So there is a portion of the population that will naturally learn to read, but all students benefit from the science of reading, of really understanding the fundamental tenets of reading. The side benefit, actually it should be one of the focuses, is that this also teaches kids how to spell. So when we're teaching the tenets of decoding, we also then are teaching the tenets of correct spelling. I'm going to pause for just a second because there's the next sign interpreter. I didn't want to get going too fast. Okay, so one other key factor in this is that reading is not necessarily hardwired into the brain. We can actually watch the brain change as we teach kids particular reading skills. And Sandra's going to talk about that a little bit more later. Okay. Our next statement, should we actually be teaching phonics? Does it work? Is it boring? And the fact of the matter is it's not. And Sandra, I'm going to let you jump in and take this one.
Oh, sure. Phonics is actually a tool that works. And so it's really empowering for kids. And as we all know, when kids feel empowered and confident with something, they tend to find that fun. And it can be fun to teach phonics. There's lots of ways that games can be brought into it. And it's vital that we do it because, contrary to popular belief, English is a phonetically regular language. 96% of the words adhere to the rules, and the ones that don't are very few. And we'll talk more about that later.
And key in all of this is it creates equity. So when we go back and give everybody the baseline skill set, everybody has an equal opportunity to come to reading and be proficient. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, and I'll come back to it in a minute. So our next great myth is that there is a visual issue when our kids actually have difficulty coming to reading. I have many students that have been taken to ophthalmologists and optometrists that have had lots of assessment done or suggested therapy. And when we look at the science does not point to this being a visual issue. Yes, we see the words, which we're going to call graphemes, and we interpret them visually. However, when we actually read the word, we're turning those symbols into language. And so we're actually processing language. So we can very easily address a lot of these underlying issues with the right kind of direct instruction. So if it's not about readiness, and it's not about motivation, and it's not about exposure or vision, what is it about? And we're going to begin with a short activity. And so this is going to give you a sense of what it feels like to be a new reader. So we've got a code over here, and when I'm going to show you a passage in a minute, the code will actually be there. When you see a Q, you're going to pronounce that as a D or a T. When you see a Z, you're going to pronounce it mm. So, for example, if you were to see this, you would pronounce it as tar or bar. This would be mat, and this would be bed. We're going to give you a standard amount of time, an average amount of time to read the passage, and then we're going to come back and talk about it in just a minute. So go ahead and begin reading this. So I gave everybody exactly 30 seconds there. We're curious, and please feel free to put your ideas in the chat. Did you have a particular strategy that you used to help you try and decode that passage? Did you have something that you thought could make it easier? How many of you stopped reading about halfway into the time? And how many of you were guessing? So let's hear a few of the comments.
We've got a number of different people saying more time. I got 4 words in. I gave up. Definitely started just guessing once I felt rushed. I got paranoid and kept wanting to check to see if I was right. That's a good one. A memory for how things might sound. Mostly guessed. Tried to speak the words out loud. Tried to use the code and then guessed. I think there's a lot. Read about one line, gave up. That was so confusing and overwhelming.
That's great.
I think that people have, there's a bunch more, but I think that we kind of get the gist of it.
So this is the actual passage. I'm going to give you a few seconds to actually read that now. And we've actually pulled this in as an activity from understood.org, which really has some of this great information available to you. So, what do most people need to be effectively taught how to read and spell? So we're going to start by discussing the 6 elements of effective reading, and the title of that is Structured Literacy, and it grew out of the science of reading. So in the early 2000s, there were a group of professionals that got together. They did a deep meta-analysis of the research literature, meaning they went back and they examined all of the studies in reading, and they asked if it met the standards of science. And then they analyzed the data to draw very clear conclusions about what worked and how effective it actually was. We then created the overall arching term, structured literacy. Sandra's favorite saying about structured literacy is?
It's not a particular curriculum. It's not something you can go out and buy or adopt by your district. Rather, it's a collection of these 6 elements that describe the best way to teach reading to get the very best outcomes for all kids.
We'll let you continue from there.
Sure. So I'm going to read, this looks very jargony, so I'm actually going to read these off. Phonology, sound symbol correspondence, the 6 syllable types and how we divide them up, something called morphology that has to do with the meanings, the meaning units within words, syntax, which has to do with the order of words in a sentence, and semantics, which has to do with the meanings of words. Thanks. Okay. So the first element of structured literacy that we will approach is going to be phonology. But I also would like to point out that those 6 elements fit kind of neatly into a framework. And the first part of that is that we have to be able to read words fluently before we can comprehend anything. And since the main goal of reading is to comprehend, we first have to be able to read the words. So the first 3 elements of structured literacy support the learning of fluent word reading. And the second 3 elements support language comprehension, our ability to make sense of what we're reading, to make sense of the sentences and how they fit together. And morphology really bridges the gap between both of those, because elements of morphology support word reading and they support comprehension. Okay. The whole point, the whole reason we do this is to extract meaning from the text. And there's a quote by Anita Archer that I think is so wonderful. I'm going to read it out loud verbatim. There is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact you can't read the words. So the very first task of teaching reading is to make sure that kids have the skills they need to be able to decode and read words accurately. Okay. The first element of structured literacy then is phonology. Okay. Phonology is the linguistic foundation for reading. And you've probably heard of it before. You may have, back one slide, please. Yeah, yes, it goes by some other names. There are some very closely related You may have heard phonological processing. You may have heard phonological awareness, or likely you've heard the term phonemic awareness. There's subtle differences between those, but for the purposes of most teachers and parents, I think it's fine to lump them together. So what is it? Okay.
I'm going to take 2 seconds because I just realized something, Sandra. I'm going to apologize for everybody for 1 second. I think I have. No, I guess I am in the right. I'm remembering, Sandra, that we had some slides that we're not seeing now, but we are in the right slide. So my apologies on that. We are in the right place, and I will just continue going forward.
Okay.
And I am not sharing correctly. Give me 1 second here.
That is fine. I am here to roll with whatever happens.
There we go. My apologies. Okay.
Okay, can you, let's see, make sure I know where I am. Okay, so phonology has to do with the sound units that make up spoken words. And phono is Greek and it means sound. And one task of phonological awareness is to be able to discern and pick out the individual sound units within words without relation to how those words are spelled. So take a moment and think about the word boat. How many sounds do you hear in boat? And in through and in which? Okay, Cindy. You can. Oh, no, back 1 slide, please. Yeah. So boat has 3 sounds, despite the fact it has 4 letters. We have B, O, T. And despite the many letters in through, there are 3 sounds. Oo. And despite the T in which, there are only 3 sounds in which. W, I, ch. And I've heard many parents over the years pretending to their kids that they can hear the T in which and trying to get their kids to hear it. And I'm here to reassure you that you cannot hear the T in which. So it's okay. And the other thing that's really important I want to point out about that is the final sound in the word boat is T. It is not ta, because ta is actually 2 sounds. It's T and So the final sound in the word boat is T. The final sound in the word which is ch. It's not cha. And this goes for many of the other sound units or phonemes within words. Okay. We assess phonology by asking kids to do phoneme manipulation tasks where they play around with the sound units within words. So we might ask them to say the word slip. Now say the word slip without saying oh. And so students with weak phonological skills might say sip or sil, or they might just repeat the word slip back to us. Another phonological skill is being able to tell when words sound the same. So rhyming, whether they begin with the same sound or end with the same sound, those are phonological skills. When you hear the word horse and house, can you tell that those words are different and not the same? Can you say utility sink, or does it come out utility sink? So being able to pronounce and remember long words. And can you repeat back a long sentence or a set of instructions? If you can, you're using your phonological skills. If you can hold a phone number in your short-term memory while you enter it into your contacts in your phone, that's a phonological skill. No?
I still can't.
Oh, you still can't. Okay, I thought you were telling
People
me that was not a
repeat to me
phonological
all
skill.
the time.
That's a phonological skill. So now we can cut and paste. So that's really helpful. So here's an example of how we use phonological skills when we read. We have to be able to pull apart the word to blend the sounds that we see. And I'm going to turn on my annotation tool here again. I think best when my hands are moving. We have to be able to say j, p, and then blend those to say jump. And I had a student who said to me, I hate the word jump, and I don't like camp, and I don't like limp because I don't like the silent M. So while he could pronounce those words correctly and he could certainly hear them, it was very difficult for him to discern the sound in jump. Kids need to be able to segment in order to spell. If I want to spell jump, I must be able to go j, and get all those sounds in the right order. It's also a phonological skill to be able to retain the first part of a sentence you've read by the time you get to the end of it, to be able to hold that in kind of your short-term auditory memory. Thanks. Let me just clear the screen. Okay. So when it's not working well, or when children are making mistakes that have to do with phonological processing, it shows up in some really interesting ways. Jump without the M, which I just kind of explained a little bit. You may notice when you say and when you say p, your mouth begins those sounds the exact same way. So it's understandable that that could get lost for some kids. They may leave sounds out when they are spelling words, leaving the or the R out of scrap. I see this one a lot. It might seem really weird that a kid would spell drop with a J, but again, if you go into your mouth and explore the linguistics of the thing, when you say the J sound, j, your tongue is pretty much exactly in the same place as when you say the DR blend, dur. So it's quite a reasonable error that many kids make. Thank you. Okay. You can flip the slide. So understanding that phonological piece helps us make better sense of kids' mistakes. And when we can do that, we can better give them what they need to improve their reading and improve their spelling. It's really like shining a light on what seems like a mystery. Why a kid would spell drop with the letter J is not really a mystery at all. Okay. I'm going to tell you a little story here. There was a group of adults who were struggling readers, and they participated in a study where they were put in a functional MRI machine, which takes images of the brain as it's doing things. And these adults were asked to read. So they went in the fMRI machine and they were reading. And meanwhile, the technology took images of their brain and noted what parts of their brain they were using to read. And then the adults were put through a 6 to 8 week program of deep phonological training. And I will tell you that they were first removed from the fMRI machine before they spent 6 to 8 weeks learning phonology. But then after that intervention, they went back into the fMRI and additional images were taken, and they were using different parts of their brain to read. And it turns out those new parts were much more efficient. And so that shows us, that demonstrates that struggling readers are using their brains differently when they read, and that phonology can make a huge difference, and that it can be taught at any age. And the younger it's taught, and the younger students are when they get that foundation, the less likely they are to go on to develop reading problems at all. And it's probably important to say here, since I understand there are many special education teachers with us tonight, that dyslexia, one of the most significant underlying challenges with dyslexia is phonological processing. Okay. The next element of structured literacy is the relationship between sounds and symbols. Okay. If phonology is the foundation of our reading house, I like to think of the sound symbol correspondence as being the studs or the framework that holds everything up. I'm just going to make sure that I'm not missing anything here. So to read, we first must be able to decode the words. And to decode the words, we need to know the rules. So a study of sound symbol association is in many ways a study of phonics. And an example of a rule that kids can learn that makes it much easier for them to read is to understand that the letter C makes two different sounds. It says k, not ka, but k, and it says s. And it's not really a mystery how to know which sound to utter when you see the letter C, because if C is followed by an E, I, or Y, we say s. And that is in fact one of the most reliable spelling rules in English. English is in fact a phonetic language, contrary to popular belief and sometimes aggressive opinion. It is a phonetic, written English is phonetic. And guessing from context does not support children's growth as readers at all. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. If you don't know how to sound out the word at all, you're likely to guess. And we discovered that when we did the simulation at the beginning. The urge to guess was powerful. And if you don't know the rules for reading this word that I understand is in Polish, you're sunk. You can't pronounce it. You may be able to get a little bit of the meaning. And Cindy will tell us about this Purple Challenge video, which is absolutely fascinating. And it is included at the beginning of the chat if you want to watch it yourself later.
So there is a clinical psychologist who sat down with her daughter, and the child had been sent home with a leveled reader, and part of the topic of the book was the word purple. And so the mother videotaped the student reading the book just as it had been laid out. So she would turn page by page, and the student her daughter appeared to be reading the text fluently and appeared to understand exactly what was happening where. She then took the pictures away and asked the student to read the text. And all of that ability that she had not been based in decoding, it had been based in guess. So she was using the pictures as cues to tell her what the words were and what she should be inferring based on the context of the material she was viewing in the book. It's a great video. It's worth taking about 15 minutes to actually see the run through of it. And so I would encourage everybody after this to do that.
Thanks. Another example of a drawback of not being able to decode is that you lose an opportunity to learn vocabulary. And after a certain age, and Cindy, I think it might be like third grade, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that most of the new vocabulary we acquire through reading, and that includes audiobooks or being read aloud to. So leaves are green because they contain a compound called, I can't decode that word, so I'm just going to keep reading. What I get is that there's something in leaves that make them green, but I don't know what it is. And again, Cindy has a fantastic story about this one as well.
So my bachelor's degree is actually in the sciences. I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry, but I very vividly remember sitting in a number of biology classes. And prior to the actual class, I had read the book, and the professor would be up talking about a term that I just wasn't familiar with at all. And then he would eventually go write it up on the board and pronounce it. And it would finally link the way I had been reading the word was not the way it was actually pronounced. So I had two different identities for those words. And that's occurred many, many, many times for me throughout my life.
Thanks. This is interesting. Studies have shown that poor readers are working the frontal cortex of their brains really hard. They are using their reasoning skills and their intellect to identify words. They're using context. Good readers, on the other hand, initially are using their phonological skills, and then later, as they learn more and more words, as their sight vocabulary, they're using the back part of their brain, the visual centers of their brain. So when we encourage students to guess from context, we're actually training them to read like poor readers. So it's really, it's not just that it doesn't work as well, it actually trains kids to read less efficiently and less effectively. Having said that, context is a really important way for us to get the meanings of words in sentences, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit.
So
Oh, go ahead, Cindy.
I wanted to stop for a minute, Sandra, because we skipped this really important element, because we've sat here and we've introduced a number of components of reading, and we've talked about them as if they're fact, and all of our teachers should be knowing this. And you were supposed to tell us a story at the beginning. So I'm going to take a pause for a moment right now and let you give context and tell this story, because I think for those that are out there scratching their head saying, why do I not know this? So why don't you go ahead and tell us about Silas?
Okay, it's okay to not know this. Well, there's no shame, I guess, is what I'm saying, in not knowing this. This story begins in the 90s when I was in my teacher training program. And the professor stood before our class and said, and discussed the way, the natural and developmental way in which kids acquire language. Even humans with profound disabilities acquire some language. And then she made a case for how acquiring reading was just as natural as acquiring the language. And it was really, it was beautiful. Like it was this joy, like learning to read can be this joyful, natural thing. And I was enchanted by that idea, as were many of my classmates. So when I graduated, I was immediately hired as a second grade teacher, and you can imagine where this is going. Right away, I met Silas, who was a wonderful second grade boy. He was a gifted athlete. He was talented in his social abilities. He was a good math student. He could not read. And I did all this holistic stuff with him. I sat with him. I read with him. I made games out of the words in the book. And I made sure that reading was fun, and we read things he was interested in, and he didn't learn to read. At the end of the school year, his parents wrote me a card. And in the card, they thanked me for guiding Silas through the school year with his self-esteem intact. Because after 3 years of failure to read, that was the best that they were hoping for him. And so I went on and I continued my journey as a classroom teacher, and I ended up in a public school, and I had similar experiences where I'd get these bright kids and I just wasn't able to help them to the extent to which I wanted to do so. And one year, the school I was in hired a reading specialist whose name was Debbie. And I asked her to read with one of my girls and to give me some insights, like what can I do to help? And Debbie read with my student. And when she was done, she said, I think that child has some phonological awareness issues. And I had never heard that term before. And I was intrigued because it sounded like, first of all, this is something really specific. Like there's a reason why this child isn't reading well. And if there's a reason, then maybe we can do something about it. And I literally, like at my prep period, I like ran up to Debbie's office and I said, how can I know what you know? And she gave me a couple names of people. She told me where I could get training. And that's what I did for the next year and a half. I kind of went into a deep study of the science of reading. And then I had a baby. And so I left my classroom job and ended up in private practice. And with my very first student, when I was a newbie with all this stuff, my first student made a year's worth of gains in only 6 months. And so I was hooked. And I guess that's the story. And by way of saying that there's no shame in not knowing some of this, and we come to it the way that we come to it, and hopefully you'll leave here tonight, if you don't already have some of these tools, with more of them to support your students. So thank you. Thanks, Cindy.
So my apologies for, like, we were supposed to tell that at the very beginning, but the reason
No
that I
worries.
stopped now to tell this is because the next thing that we're going to talk about is kind of part of the heart and soul of decoding instruction, and that's around syllable type instruction. When I have families that come in who are evaluated by me, I will advocate for some of those families when we go in to develop an individualized education plan or an IEP. And I often find that I'm in a classroom situation where I talk to teachers about the 6 syllable types, and most of them look at me like I'm nuts. So I wanted to give the context of Sandra's story as we step into this, because I'm going to talk about syllables as if this is something that everybody should know. And most people will wonder why they don't know. And the answer is, we're not teaching it, and we absolutely should be. So a syllable is the actual beat in a word. And a characteristic of a syllable is that it only has one vowel sound. Sandra, why don't you do your demonstration of how to tap out words? Do you want to do it back here with these?
Sure, I can. So, and many of you teachers, I'm sure that many of you already instruct students in breaking words apart into syllables. And I know students come to me having been taught to clap, volcano. Some students come to me having been taught to feel for their chin dropping as they utter each vowel sound, volcano. And some students will, and this is what I do in my private practice, teach students to use their bodies, volcano, to further help them differentiate between syllables.
So how many syllables are in the word hopefully? How about thorough? Through. See, I always do that. It's the good dyslexic in me. We've only done that one like 6 times and I still do that.
Cindy, I led you into that word, and we'll talk more about that later.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then we have missed. And Sandra, why don't you go ahead and show how you divide those into syllables, since I've already like,
Not a worry. Not a worry at all. Let me make sure my annotation tool is on here. Okay, so each syllable has one vowel sound. It may have more than one vowel letter. So hopefully we have hopefully. And you'll notice the first syllable has 2 vowel letters, but that's okay. It only has one vowel sound, O. Through, single syllable, single vowel sound. The vowel sound is oo. And missed, single syllable, the vowel sound is I. Okay.
so when we think about structured literacy, one of the most important and central concepts is direct instruction in the 6 syllable types. Now, as Sandra mentioned previously, there are lots of curriculums that fall under the umbrella of structured literacy. Not all of them approach the syllables in exactly the same way. So these are the ones that I'm familiar with and the way that I've taught them. And so if you've been taught in a different curriculum and you view them in a slightly different way, it's still the same central component of this, okay? So Sandra, go ahead and walk us through the 6 syllable types.
Oh, sure. The first is what is often called an open syllable, and the vowel says its name, such as in the word he. There's nothing following that syllable. Cap, a, closed syllable. People sometimes call these short vowels. Another syllable type in English is the silent E or magic E or bossy E syllable, where the vowel says its name, as in cape. And then vowel teams, where 2 vowel letters are working together to represent one sound. In English, there are only 5 vowel letters, or 6, sometimes with Y, but there are 18 vowel sounds in our language. And we don't have an individual letter to represent each of those 18 sounds, so these letters team up. Something known as R-controlled vowels, R, and or. That's a vowel sound linguistically in our language, despite the presence of the letter R, which most of us think of as a consonant. And then consonant plus LE is also a syllable type. In the word cable, the second syllable is bull, and the vowel sound is actually And so consonant LE is considered a syllable type in English. Okay. Can you read this word? We need to know how to accurately divide words into syllables, because that word was moping, and many, many people will read that word as mopping. And so rules of syllable division help students understand why one of these words is mopping and why the other one of these words is moping. The same is true for rubble and ruble. And a student approaching a word like this that they may not hear in their everyday lives, but they may read it, we want them to say caper, and we don't want them to say capper. And the rules of syllable division will help them with that. Okay, this is my favorite slide. Can you read this word? I'm going to break this word apart by syllables. More, faux, phonemic. Morphophonemic. Now I'm going to break this word apart in a different way. Morpho, phoneme, ick. I've broken that word apart by syllable. I've also broken that word apart by meaning, okay? Written English is what's known as a morphophonemic code. That means that groups of letters represent sound, and they also represent meaning. And so sometimes it's most efficient for us to break words apart by sound, like in the mopping and moping example you just saw. Other times it's more efficient to break words apart by meaning. Thanks. And then I think you take it from here, Cindy.
Yes, my apologies in some of the flip backs and forths. So
it's totally fine. Yeah.
So now we're going to spend some time talking about another area. This is called morphology. And morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in a word. So for example, when we have one cat, that is very different from having multiple cats. The final sound in that word, or the letter S on the end of the word, dramatically changes the meaning. Just like when we have words like rewrite, we have elements, the re tells us that we're going to write again, okay? So when we look at words, we can spend time breaking it down and using the morphemes to help us identify the units of meaning. So for example, if we look at un and happy, we've got two different units there that help us come to the meaning of that word. Similarly, teacher, we have teach and or predictable actually has three I'm going to botch the words, morphological units in the word. And I am having a slight mouse problem here. My apologies. I'm getting closer. There we go. Okay, so when we come in and look at them now, we've actually broken them into the morphological units. We've got each of those elements in there. When kids know the meaning behind pre and able, when they see it used in a new context, they can use that knowledge to interpret the meaning of the word. It can also help them decode the word more accurately. So our language, English, is heavily morphophonemic, okay? We use that to help us read words more efficiently. And so it also can help us drive our spelling. So many students, very young students, when they go to write the past tense of a word, don't recognize that the ed on the end of the word can say ed, d, or t. And so they will spell the sound that they hear, not recognizing the morphological unit. When they are explicitly taught that element, we change the way they approach the spelling of that. Morphemes also help us figure out what words mean. So when we have export versus import, it tells us about things going away or things coming in. The word dis-ease takes on a new meaning when you recognize that dis means not and ease is the well-being.
It wasn't until I realized that I could accurately spell disease, and I was quite old.
Okay, so when we teach everybody about morphology, it makes reading accessible for everybody. It's not about being in a family unit in which every member uses rich vocabulary, often vocabulary that is more obscure. This makes this a tool that students can use throughout their educational career. It gives them a deeper understanding of the English language, and it helps them use more sophisticated vocabulary to describe exactly what they're thinking. This is an example of a morphological error that I just love. I'm sure more than a few of you are chuckling about this. It makes me want to go mispark my car. So morphology also then becomes a central element in language comprehension. And so we've bridged the meaning of the word into that element. And so the next thing that we're going to talk about is syntax. Syntax is the order of the words in a sentence, and changing the order of words changes the meaning. Syntax also encapsulates capitalization and punctuation. And again, when we teach this explicitly, our students are better able to understand what they've read. Here's a wonderful example I use all of the time. In one of the sentences, the elephant only wanted one thing to eat. And the other sentence, there were lots of things to eat, but the elephant is the only one that ate the banana. Here's another excellent example of where errors in capitalization and punctuation have made significant changes in probably the desired meaning of the individual that developed the sign. I personally plan on staying away from the hiking trail. So the other place that syntax is particularly useful is as we move into more dense and rich text. So as you approach a single sentence like this, if you don't have a strategy to break this down, it is very difficult to get to the meaning of this. I will often take students and we segment elements and we talk about phrases and what those phrases mean. It empowers them to digest complex and meaningful text in a completely different way. So in our next slide, we can see where we've highlighted those critical words so that students know what to focus on. And when they've understood that central element, we can then add the subtle elements of the other additional words contained in it. I have many students that take high school government or history classes that are asked to read historical texts that are not written with today's current syntax. I think I've got somebody adding some annotations there.
Oh, I'm not.
That's okay. So
Clear it.
thank you. When we do teach syntax, it helps students also differentiate meaning in sentences. We have a very high correlation of syntactic skills to reading comprehension skills, okay? Another fabulous byproduct of teaching this is it improves all of our students' writing. There's a direct correlation between reading skills and written language skills. This direct, concrete instruction helps our students better express their thoughts. So teachers need to come to any reading task thinking about how they can break it down for their student so they can better understand what's in the context. Here's an example from Harry Potter. This is one sentence where there is a great deal going on. When we break it down, we know that Snape and Yaxley are heading towards a door. We've got some sound being made from gravel under our feet. Mysteriously, the door is going to swing towards us or the characters, and there's no source of that door being opened. Similarly, I'm going to let Sandra talk through this one because she sees this.
I do. Sometimes when we have a sentence, and I'll read this, even though nearly 10 years had passed since Harold started building the shed behind his house, he still hadn't finished it. Our actor or our subject is Harold. And what Harold is doing is not finishing something. And you will notice that there is a sea of language between the subject of our sentence and its verb. And that can be confusing for kids, especially kids with learning disabilities related to language. This is easier for kids. Harold hadn't finished building because the subject, Harold, is right close to its verb. And it's not that one sentence is better than another. It's just that the farther the subject is away from its verb, the more difficult the sentence can be for students to comprehend. In the first sentence, what is it that Harold hasn't finished? Is it his shed or his house? For some students, that may be a difficult distinction to make. Okay.
So we've now talked about morphology and syntax, and our next critical area is semantics. And semantics is the meaning of the word. Now, this blends in with morphology. And so you're going to hear us refer back to elements of morphology in this. But when we think about semantics, there's three key elements. We focus on the origins of the words, the rich vocabulary, and multiple meanings. So the English language as a whole has origins in Anglo-Saxon or Old English or Germanic language, Latin, and Greek. And when you know the origin of the word, it dramatically changes your ability to spell the word. It also gives you a sense of the different kinds of meanings. So for example, here we have a healer in which we have a person doing something and it's spelled ER versus a doctor in which the spelling is OR. You can see the difference in the subtlety of the definition in each of those words. This gives us meaning behind terms like hippopotamus. When you recognize the origins of those elements, it explains it as a river horse. So one of my most common observed errors in reading comprehension with early readers is they will have difficulty with multiple meanings of a word. So they will read a word and immediately go to their most known or common use of that word. We have a great example here with the word bar that has lots of variations. And so we have to take the time to teach our students how to think dynamically to come to the various meanings, and we need to teach those meanings explicitly. Sandra, I'm going to let you do the.
Okay. Reading comprehension is supported enormously by vocabulary. Kids with strong vocabularies do better with comprehension. And I'm going to pretend for a moment to be a student. And for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to assume that I can decode all the words in this sentence, although that's not necessarily likely in the case of the kid that I'm going to pretend to be here. Here's a vocabulary situation. Hawaii is an archipelago. Its low latitude makes it tropical. Now I'm seeing here that we have archipelago, latitude, and tropical. 3 words that we can't assume that students know. So I'm going to be the student who says, okay, tropical, I know that. Like that means it's really hot and there's palm trees and stuff there. So I get that. So archipelago, Hawaii is, okay, archipelago must mean that it's a hot place. Okay, because it's tropical. So an archipelago is a hot place. It's low latitude. So like, it's low. Something's low. That maybe the sun is low. Man, maybe the wind is low. None of those things sound right. I don't really know what latitude means. I'm getting bored. I'm just going to keep reading or space off. So that's one example of how poor vocabulary can impede your comprehension. And also I was going to also just point out that the word yet, students don't tend to think of it as meaning but there are instances in which yet means but, and that can sometimes be confusing depending on the words that come next. Thanks. I'm guilty of putting this quote in here because it demonstrates to me that this is really about reading is about literature. It's about learning from what we read. It's about so many things, and it can be fun. Let's see, I wish my annotation tool was a little thicker. This is a synthesis of everything we've just talked about. You can see that the 2 elements, word recognition and language comprehension, weave themselves together to create the overall act of skilled reading. And woven into this braid is the phonological piece that we've talked about. And they've included syllables here because determining syllables from spoken words is in fact a phonological task. Decoding the spelling, sound, or sound symbol correspondences are here. You can see that syntax and semantics play in as part of language structure. Vocabulary, which is another way of thinking about semantics, are in here. And once the word recognition pieces become fluent, more words become sight words. And we didn't talk about that in our presentation, but it's just related to getting fluent with all the skills that we did talk about. And then this background knowledge and verbal reasoning and knowledge of literacy, these are the sort of global awarenesses and skills that kids develop that do support their reading. Thank you. Did you want to say anything about that?
Nope, I think we're good.
Great, excellent.
So for parents, you may be asking the central question of how do I determine if my school is actually doing this? And the key is you need to know several of these elements and you need to go in and explicitly ask. Now that you're familiar with all of these terms, you can go in and ask your teacher about the kind of syllable type instruction she's using and when the origins of words are going to be introduced into lessons. So we're going to shift now into specific activities that you can do to help your reader. And so for teachers in the classroom, we're going to break through each of these areas and talk about specifics that you can apply in your room tomorrow. In the area of phonology, we need to understand that this is a an educationally long process of learning. This is not something that we limit just to kindergarten. We continue to teach it throughout. As you see errors or as you see unusual events occur, this is when you should be referring back to the tenets of phonology. You can encourage students when you see them make errors in spelling to help them tap out each of the sounds in a word to help them make sure that they're representing those sounds correctly. You can take the time and help them break the words into the individual syllables so that they're more accurate. When we talk about sound symbol relationships, again, we're going to be explicit. We're going to build from the most common, frequently observed, to the less common and more exception-based elements. We want to be sequential and cumulative. So we go back and we revisit elements that we've already taught, and we introduce new elements, and we're practicing all of that until it's fluid and automatic. So you can make sure that you're highlighting vowel patterns, teaching students to attend to blends. When you're creating a spelling list to send home, use the lessons of phonics or the lessons of morphology to create your actual spelling list. Rather than focusing on a topic, we should be looking at spelling patterns. We also want teachers to use controlled readers. So there's a very significant difference between a leveled reader and a decodable reader. Leveled readers are actually developed out of books that talk about vocabulary that a student at a particular grade level should have. So that's where we get words like library and teacher. When we look at the decodable reader, these are highly phonetically readable and all build off of a certain skill set to make the student highly successful in being able to approach this text. So as parents, you need to be asking for decodable readers for your students. And as teachers, you need to be asking the district to be providing you the appropriate kind of practice for your student. We want you as teachers to teach the principles of syllable division. You're going to explicitly teach those concepts. You're going to have students practice them until they are automatic. You as teachers need to learn the 6 syllable types if you're not familiar with them, and you need to go to your district and ask them to provide that kind of training. When you go to spell, have students practice breaking those words into syllable types. And Sandra loves playing games like Go Fish with syllable types and tapping. We're also going to heavily emphasize morphology. We're going to use that both in our reading and our spelling. We're going to provide explicit and direct instructions in the various elements of morphology. And we're going to play with it and make it fun. Kids love to combine things in very different ways. With syntax, we need to provide direct and explicit instruction. Students benefit from knowing the why behind using a comma. When they understand why we capitalize words, it changes the way that they read things. We need to integrate the syntax of reading with the syntax of writing. So for example, the dog drove slowly and carefully through the neighborhood so he wouldn't attract attention. That creates a certain syntactic structure, and understanding the subordinating conjunction so is a really important element.
Can I add something to that, Cindy?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we can teach grammar to kids without having even to use words like subordinating conjunction, even though it's good for us to know. You can say, you can ask students, what part of this sentence tells how? And the students can say, oh, how is here. Is there a part of this sentence that tells where? Ah, yes, through the neighborhood. Is there a part of this sentence that tells when? Why no? There really isn't. And is there a part that tells why? Yes, there is. So he wouldn't attract attention. So here I've just talked about different clauses, and some are phrases and prepositions and adverbs, and I have gotten right to the heart of the concept without even using the language. And I'm not suggesting that we isolate children from that language, but I am suggesting that instruction can be robust and meaty, and it doesn't have to look like what you might have imagined your grandmother did upon diagramming sentences in 1920 or whatever.
Oh, I was still diagramming sentences.
I know it. I think it's a good practice, but it's intimidating, and I want folks to understand that breaking apart a sentence for the meaning units doesn't have to necessarily come with a lot of baggage.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So we want to give kids lots of opportunities to play with semantics. We want to teach them how to play with language. We want to avoid rote memorization. I remember being asked to memorize definitions for the SAT. And when you just memorize a definition, when you see it in context, you can't always connect a dictionary definition with the actual meaning in the wording in text in general. We can build these skills over time. And again, knowing the Latin, Greek, Anglo-Saxon origin of the words always helps that. So, couple quick elements. What makes good structured literacy? First of all, we've mentioned this before, it's systematic, it's cumulative. We're going back and making sure that students are automatically using the elements that have been previously taught. We're assessing that on a regular basis. If they're missing something, we go back and we revisit again, we put more emphasis on it. We build in a logical progression and students understand where we're trying to go with it. We don't make assumptions. We evaluate to make sure our student has got the skill set before we continue forward. We don't assume that students will be able to intuit or infer based on context how the rule works. Good structured literacy is also diagnostic. It means, pardon me, that you are observing in the classroom the kinds of errors students are making in their reading or spelling. You can assess skills in isolation or in context. You can give practice by sending home different kinds of homework for kids to work on. We also want you as teachers to explain the rule. So never make the assumption. Sandra gave us a great example that many of you will always carry with you now of a C followed by an E, I, or Y is going to make the S sound. When students know that, they can predict and use that strategy both when they're reading and spelling. Clinical studies also suggest a multimodal approach is beneficial for students. We've shown both tapping or feeling our mouth do things. We've been hearing. Sandra has regularly been showing what we're doing so that we engage all of the senses in the process. Now, this is always a delicate subject. Unfortunately, these areas do not follow the tenets of structured literacy. Whole language is the assumption that bathing students in rich literature is going to teach them how to read. And unfortunately, whole language is what's got us here on that first graph that we looked at. We have got to move away from that method of instruction and return to the science. And if that's the only thing you leave with tonight, it's a win. Balanced literacy only pulls in specific elements of structured literacy. It emphasizes phonology and letter sound correspondence. It misses the other 6 elements. And you can begin to see through tonight's presentation how it all wraps in to make our students lifelong readers. Simply believing that guessing based on context will yield good outcomes does not work. There is no research literature that supports that. We need to be conscious of what we're doing, because students are disengaging with reading because they don't have the skill set that they need, and they avoid reading altogether. So for parents at home, there are some really interesting tricks or tips that you can do. One of my favorites is to turn on the closed captioning for any TV or video that a student is watching. Interestingly, in the deaf culture, they found that students who lived in a house with a student who was deaf and who had the closed captioning available actually learned to read faster. It was that constant exposure to print and matching the word to the spoken language that built their reading skills over time. This also means that you can provide your student books in an audible format. It's a great way to practice reading without being limited by your current skill set. It is shown a great practice to reread material. So if a student loves a book, you may be tired of the 8th or 9th rendition of it, but don't hesitate to read it again. Students benefit from that repeated reading. And one of the other strong recommendations we make is to get kids hooked on series or chapter books. Most parents who have young children have heard of the Magic Treehouse series. There's lots of great reading options out there that help kids get an understanding of where a storyline is going to go and builds their comprehension skills through the process. So now what we want to do is give you some ideas of, when you are reading at home with your student, what you can do to support them. So when a student makes an error in reading, rather than attempting to give them a visual cue, point to the word and help them attend to the overall structure of the word. Help them sound out and break apart the word if you know how to do it. If you're not comfortable knowing how to sound the word out, simply give them the word. The classic example is the witch or the catch or the watch that we've been talking about previously. If you're not sure and you recognize the word, just give them the word. There is a strong temptation to say no. Avoid the temptation. Just tell them specifically what you want them to do. Give them what they need. So what we're going to do now is we're going to model a strategy I use with a lot of students, where Sandra is going to be our new reader. Well, not necessarily new, it's going to be a somewhat of an advanced text. She's going to try to read some of these words, and I'm going to help lead her into words that I'm anticipating she's going to have a hard time with. So Sandra, why don't you start right up here with the number 1 where it starts mother.
I have to put on my other glasses. So
okay,
that's true for some kids too, and make sure they have their glasses, right?
mother,
okay, mother and dad and I were having dinner. The dinner
the dining
room
windows
were open because it had been such a hot day. All of a sudden, there was a great
swoosh
of wings. And there on the window sill sat owl. Wall.
Okay. So she is getting reinforcement, or I'm keeping her from making as many errors. Now, our next technique, by the way, that would be too difficult a passage, so a student should be making that many errors when reading that. We were overemphasizing to demonstrate the technique. If you're having that much difficulty, the student should not be trying to tackle that particular text.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cindy,
So
can I interject just real quick? We have our ASL interpreters until 8:30. And this is great and content. And I want to make sure if we have anyone on the call this evening, if you could either put it in the chat, or if you feel better to direct message the Seattle Special Education PTSA. If you need the services, I can ask the ASL interpreters to stay a little longer if possible. If not, I want to make sure that we're timely for them because they will need to be wrapping up here.
Not a problem. We'll move through rather quickly. My apologies. We've drug it out.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure. Let's just give a pause for a second.
Sure.
Okay. I haven't seen anyone give any messages or raise their hands. That's another option. So I will just let the ASL interpreters know, please, at 8:30, you can please leave, and then we can continue here as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thanks.
All right. So one other quick activity that we're going to show you is we're going to have a student read particular words in the text. So Sandra at this point is assigned the words and the. So Sandra, we're going to start here with before, and you're going to read and the.
Okay.
Before any of us had the time to move, he gave a leap
And
landed on
the
floor beside my chair.
and
He hadn't come empty-handed. Clutched in his talons was an enormous skunk.
the
Skunk was dead, but that didn't help matters much. And I think people are getting the idea, so I want to leave time for everybody to ask questions. So a couple of other strategies that we suggest is making sure that you're finding books and literature that are at an appropriate reading level for a student. If you're having them read aloud, we just gave a demonstration of where it's obviously too difficult for them. You want to keep it fun. We want students to love the story. I often encourage parents to stop at a exciting point and say, oh, I have to go work in the kitchen, or I've got to go send an email, and leave them hanging in the story. So they're looking forward to it the next day. You also want to resist the urge to push them to read more than they're capable of. If a student is a comfortable and fluent reader on the text, that's our goal. They shouldn't be struggling through the words. We want fluent readers to be smooth and conversational. You could hear my change in the prosody where my voice changed based on the inflection in the text to add depth and meaning. Fast reading doesn't mean, for many students, fast reading is not accurate reading. We want to emphasize accuracy over speed. I would rather see a low speed score on a DIBELS than a fast inaccurate score. We also want to spend some time talking to students about adjusting their reading for a particular purpose. When I read a recipe, I read very slowly. When I read Harry Potter, I can read at any rate I want. When I read a scientific article, I adjust based on the topic. Make them love the reading element. Allow them to opt out of books that they find are too difficult. And if they're really interested in it, there are great resources out there to help them find books in a particular topic area. Nancy Pearl has got a great book called Book Crush that lets you identify karate or insects or mermaids for whatever your student's preference is. And my apologies that we ran right up to the end. I believe Sandra and I are happy to stay around and answer questions for anybody who has them.
yeah, absolutely. And I saw some really good ones come through in the chat. So
Hi, sorry, I was
That's okay.
messaging with our interpreters as they were leaving, and so thank you to them for hanging with us this evening. Yeah, unfortunately, we scheduled them And they may, sometimes they can stay and sometimes they can't. Unfortunately, they couldn't this evening. So, but thank you. This has been really good content and really informative. I love the role playing you guys threw in here too. That is really tactical and concrete, especially, yeah, just for parents and for teachers alike. So, yes, so we have, Heather, were you able to collect all of the questions that we have?
I have been trying
so
to grab them
far?
out of the chat. And so
Thank you.
let me go here. So I'm going to let people, if they want to unmute and ask these themselves, if they're still here, they can. So the first question that came in that was really great was from, I think it's Lucia. How to teach phonology to someone that's nonverbal. Did you want to unmute and ask your question or more?
It's basically that. Someone that clearly understands language, and in fact, 2 languages, English and Spanish, because there is back and forth. But we're figuring out how will we be able to teach her to read. She does not talk because of cerebral palsy.
So you can actually ask her if she can discriminate between sounds. So a yes, no response of, do these sound the same? Do they sound different? Helping her by you showing this makes this sound and very clearly articulating it. Sandra did a great job today of making sure that when she said a sound, she produced 1 phoneme. You may need to spend a little bit of time getting more familiar with the letter sound correspondence and how the phonemes are produced, but then you can very clearly segment them for the child so you can build that skill, attaching it to the visual image of the text. And then you would assess that through some comprehension activities. So you, for example, you could have cat versus cats and ask them to identify which picture it matched. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
There's a great series by Peggy Kay that also offers some really great games that you could adapt.
Can you spell the author, please?
Yes, Peggy, Peggy, Kaye. She wrote games for reading, games for writing, games for math, games for learning, and she's got a huge array of how to make these very visual.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Our next question was from Ashley. Ashley, did you want to unmute and ask? It was around hyperlexia.
Yeah, so our son was diagnosed with hyperlexia. I think it might have been a low-hanging fruit because he has autism and loves to read and has poor reading comprehension. But we also have found that he seems to have a hard time decoding. Like, he was in the 30th percentile in phonemic proficiency, but yet, like in the dyslexia screener in the Y4, he was in the 95th percentile. So he's a bit of a mystery. Oh, for word reading. I'm sorry, for word reading. I think he memorizes the words and he skips over things, and he will substitute contextual with another word that starts with C and ends with L. So my question is, I know that we attack reading comprehension if he's hyperlexic, but if he possibly is stealth dyslexic and it's not getting caught, where do we go with something like this? Do we start with phonemic stuff? Is it different for hyperlexia?
So a hyperlexic, so the other person that helped us develop this presentation is actually hyperlexic, and she can read in any language. She's just naturally sees the patterns and can pull them off. And I'm always in great awe of her because I have no ability to do that whatsoever. So I would do a number of things. So I would actually ask your child to spend a great deal of time attending to the overall structure of the word and asking them to really slow down and attend to the overall structure of the word. There are a number of visual training activities on the iPad. I will send a materials list to the group and point out where that reference is in some of the iPad games. So you can teach his eye to go in. For the dyslexia piece, while we've mentioned phonemic awareness is not the only thing that makes you dyslexic. You can also have issues with rapid automatic naming, or orthographic processing. At that point, you may need to look at a more comprehensive evaluation with somebody who has a broader understanding and a better ability to provide a differential diagnosis and really segment it out and know how to elicit the different kinds of problems. So doing an oral reading fluency measure, doing some rapid naming activities, those kinds of things.
Okay, do you have any recommendations for a person to do that?
So Liz Smith, I would send you to the WABDA website, the Washington branch of the International Dyslexia Association. Those are the kinds of evaluations I do. I don't want to be here to plug myself, but the website has a list of a number of clinicians, speech language pathologists who specialize in dyslexia can do these kinds of assessments. You want to find somebody who has a strong background in understanding the tenets of structured literacy to help you differentiate that. And if you're asking about rapid naming and phonemic awareness and they don't know what that is, that's not the right clinician.
Thank you.
All right, I have one more question from earlier in the presentation. Pam has her hand raised to ask, and I've got a couple newer questions in the chat, but I want to get to this one first. So this is from Susan. So when you were providing those samples for parents and teachers, she wanted to know, what should we be looking for teachers to be doing in a kindergarten classroom?
In a kindergarten classroom, kids should be spending a lot of time playing with sounds. They should be working on segmenting sounds. They should be working on discriminating between sounds. There should be lots of letter play. There should be lots of practice in really basic words and recognizing how to sound out words. So we can begin to teach many of those basic elements very early on. It is not magical that when you hit first grade, that's where we're going to teach you to decode. We can begin teaching that much earlier. There's fabulous curriculum out there. There's Explode the Code. There's Get Ready for the Code. There's a lot of different things out there that we can be doing. I would also be exposing kids to lots and lots of literature that they're intrigued by the story, not that we're expecting them to read it, but that they're listening and hearing elements, that they're asking questions about words that they're not familiar with, that they've got a sense of the character, theme, plot, setting, not necessarily in those specific words, but what do you think the character might do next? So predicting, playing with the language, playing rhyming games. Again, lots of different options there.
Thanks, Cindy. All right, Pam, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, this is Pam. I'm wondering, so my son, and I think like many on this call, during remote learning and particularly and during the pandemic, didn't receive a significant amount of instruction. And so what I'm seeing as he's returning to school, is that the class moves forward, but some of that basic knowledge, like you're talking about, especially in his case for writing, it was missed. Yeah. And so I'm wondering what recommendations you have for addressing that. Thank you.
So this is going back to the district and saying we need to go back and we need to be using structured literacy and we need to be evaluating where kids are and building that up. So the school district should be coming in and assessing where students are and going back and teaching elements that have been missed. I would encourage you to talk to the administration and ask them to do these kinds of things. It's part of the purpose of the school system. I see Alicia Robert Franks is here. I want to put in a plug that she has got lots of structured literacy instruction available for free to teachers across Washington state. She's always got classes going. Teachers have access to this material. Schools need to require them to be doing it, but you need to be going back and asking the school to assess where your child is at and identify where the issues are.
Sorry, I'm grabbing
okay.
I'm grabbing the link to put in there for Alicia's
I
classes.
was
really
just
quick.
trying
Sorry.
to find the same
I
one. Heather.
wasn't so. So
I was
you
just going
can.
to tell Alicia to put it in there because I know she's got it handy.
I did put it in.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank
thanks.
you very much.
Yeah, yeah. If you go to PD Enroller and put in dyslexia, Alicia's classes are going to come up, and that's a really great plug for our teaching staff and support staff that are here. And it's also great to share out if you're a parent and you've got a concern, share it with your school team, share it with your BLT team, right? Like this is a great way to support that needed professional development for our teachers. Again, as Sandra was saying, this is not anyone's fault that you didn't get this in your teacher training program. You know, but when we know better, we do better. So we're all learning and we're working to make literacy better for all students. So Tina has been putting some, she's got some concerns in the chat. She has a kiddo who is in 3rd grade. Her team, she also has ADHD, wondering if she should look at dyslexia. The team saying that the student is close to grade level, but what she is seeing with the reading, she is concerned that's not there. Is able to comprehend, it sounds like, more complex texts. And so she's wondering, where should she start?
So when you talk to the team about evaluating your student, you need to make sure that they're having the student read both real and nonsense words. So the nonsense words get around the students that have memorized a particular site vocabulary. There is no specific way that you can cheat on nonsense words. You have to have the underlying skill set. The next piece is to use a oral reading assessment. My personal favorite that I use with every single student is the Gray Oral Reading Test. The GORT-5 is the acronym, G-O-R-T. It requires students to read out loud. Unfortunately, instruction is as fast and as accurately because that's the standardization, but every error is marked and it gets at the core of some of these issues that are missed in other dynamics. The law does require an assessment on oral reading fluency. So going back and asking for that specific test to be administered is a great way to better elicit what's happening.
I love the GORT-5. I'm just gonna
Yeah, I
say.
was saying
Yeah, I
great.
use it. I use it too. And
I'm going to quote Dr. Kelly Sandman Hurley. There's nowhere to hide in the GORT-5.
Yep.
That's
a
that
great
is
rhyme.
true.
I love that.
I know. She said that and she's like, there's nowhere to hide in the GORT-5. I'm like, oh, I'm so taking that from you. It's so good.
Most clinicians are intimidated by it because it's a lot to score. But
it is, but I think that you get that really true understanding of how a student's doing. And I think it's also, Cindy, I'm going to just jump in here. It's also really important that if your student's being assessed for something, we want to make sure that if they're looking at fluency, which is a really, especially if you've done some remediation already, that fluency test is really critical and it needs to truly measure that oral reading fluency. Sometimes I see like the KTA silent reading fluency in assessments. And it's not a valid test, especially in Washington State. There is really clear instruction that it has to be oral and it has to look at both or 3 things: prosody. So is it sounding like natural speech, rate, and accuracy? So really, that's, I think, a really important thing for parents when they're seeing those fluency assessments. Are all those things being looked at? Or is it an estimate of an estimated fluency rate? Because we don't want that. All righty.
I was giggling at Tina's comment. Sorry, I apologize. I didn't realize I was off mute. I just want to do a quick time check for us. We are at 8:47. I don't think there's any more questions that have come up in the chat. Did you see any more, Heather?
I don't. I was just doing another quick look.
Okay.
Please feel free to join us. Oh, sorry.
one more just came in. Heather, you want to take it? And then I think that I'll call this our last one, and we'll end the recording and do a couple quick announcements. Heather, are you frozen?
Yep.
Oh no. Okay, so I'll take it. From Blythe, it says, my daughter is in high school and was diagnosed late in school. She completed the Wired for Reading program, but received no help from the public school district except an IEP and a learning strats class. Is there anything I could be doing now to help her? A high school student who's still struggling with dyslexia, it seems.
So it suggests to me that the Wired for Reading curriculum stopped too soon, and that there wasn't a continuation into the other elements, which is the reading comprehension elements. And so there needs to be more of the direct instruction in the syntax and semantics, and going back and revisiting the morphology and word origin element to really get to the meaning. There needs to be more structured and direct instruction in techniques. And there is a curriculum by Joanne Carlisle, sorry, said that wrong, Carlisle, called the Reading and Reasoning series. There's a beginning 1 and 2 book that really breaks the semantic component down into the word, sentence, passage, and then the logical reasoning elements of reading. It's a basis to begin to think about how to build the reading comprehension skills. My materials list will have a number of reading comprehension curriculum there as a reference for you to look at to find some more help.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been so helpful. I'm going to stop recording so that